Tonight's story brings us deep into Louisiana's plantation country, to a secret so disturbing that even those who profited from the system struggled to face it. So get comfortable, lower the lights, and listen closely. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a warning. The ledger lay open on the plantation desk, its pages swollen from years of damp southern air and yellowed with age. Ink had seeped slightly into the paper fibers, blurring names and numbers. But the overseer could still make out every entry clearly enough. His hand shook as he lifted the lantern closer, not from the heat or the long hours already worked, but because of what the ledger held. It wasn't the accounts of cotton yields or tobacco sales that troubled him. It was the column he'd been told to keep separate, folded inward and hidden from casual eyes, as if secrecy alone could make it vanish. A column tracking something no one wanted to discuss. Yet everyone had begun to notice. The entries now stretched back 7 years, each more unsettling than the last. Dates, plantation names, the names of enslaved women, and beside them, brief descriptions written in careful, restrained language: blue eyes, blonde hair, fair skin that darkened only slightly as the children grew older. All born to enslaved women across 3 Louisiana parishes. All different mothers, yet all bearing children who looked nothing like their mothers. Nothing like their recorded fathers, nothing like anyone else in the quarters. The overseer swallowed hard as he turned another page, knowing that once you saw the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. And the whispers had already begun. Whispers that moved faster than riverboats along the Mississippi, slipping from plantation to plantation, like a sickness no one could contain. Traders carried them. Runaways breathed them in the swamps before vanishing into the night. House servants repeated fragments overheard while pouring wine or standing silently in corners during tense conversations between masters. Midwives spoke in hushed voices, hands still trembling from deliveries that had left them shaken to their core. They had brought these strange babies into the world, wiped their faces, looked into eyes that shouldn't exist, and felt their blood run cold, because someone was fathering these children. Someone with access to multiple plantations. Someone who moved unseen, unchallenged. Someone who left no trace of himself except the evidence written plainly in the faces of infants who should not exist, according to every rule the system claimed to enforce. No one knew his name, or if they did, they dared not speak it aloud. In a world built on silence and fear, truth itself had learned to whisper. Before we continue, if stories like this grip you, disturb you, and make you question what you thought you knew about history, make sure you're subscribed to the Veil of Fear and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. History may be rooted in the past, but the people uncovering it are very much alive today. Now, let's return to those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. The mystery would stretch across 7 long years. It would consume lives, destroy families, and unravel carefully maintained illusions. It would reveal a truth so calculated, so cruel that even hardened plantation owners, men accustomed to violence, profit, and suffering, would struggle to comprehend it. But in 1837, when the first of these children was born, no one yet understood what they were witnessing. What seemed at first like a single anomaly, a strange but dismissible occurrence, would slowly reveal itself as something far more sinister. What began as an exception would harden into a pattern, and patterns in a place like Louisiana meant intention. They meant planning. They meant power. That pattern would eventually shake the foundations of plantation society, expose the darkest corners of a system built on human bondage, and reveal how absolute power could be wielded without consequence, when the law itself existed to protect the perpetrator. Louisiana in the late 1830s was a land of contradictions and extremes. New Orleans stood as one of America's wealthiest cities, its port overflowing with sugar, cotton, and enslaved people arriving by the thousands. French and Spanish colonial influences still shaped the culture, the architecture, even the rhythm of daily life. Creole French blended with English, Spanish, and African languages, creating a linguistic tapestry found nowhere else in the country. The city dazzled visitors. Theaters hosted opera and ballet. Restaurants served cuisine that rivaled Paris itself. Ballrooms glittered beneath chandeliers shipped from Europe, while silk dresses and polished shoes moved gracefully across marble floors. Gas lamps illuminated elegant streets and grand homes, projecting an image of refinement and prosperity. But beyond those lights, beyond the manicured gardens and ornate facades, another world ruled with absolute authority. The plantation economy dominated everything beyond the city's edge. North of New Orleans, the parishes of St. James, St. John the Baptist, and Ascension formed the heart of Louisiana's sugar country. This was not the cotton south of endless fields and scattered isolation. Sugar demanded something else entirely. Sugar cultivation required precision, speed, and relentless labor. Cane had to be harvested and processed within a narrow window before frost ruined the crop. From October through December, the grinding season transformed plantations into nonstop industrial operations. Mills ran day and night. Fires burned constantly beneath massive kettles. The air filled with steam, smoke, and the sharp, sickly sweet smell of boiling cane juice. Enslaved people worked shifts that stretched 18, 20, sometimes even 22 hours. They cut cane under the weak November sun, hauled it in heavy loads to the sugar houses, fed stalks into grinding mills that showed no mercy. They boiled the juice, stirred it as it thickened, packed crystallized sugar into hogsheads for shipment. Exhaustion was constant. Injuries were inevitable. The machinery was unforgiving. Loose clothing, long hair, even a moment's distraction could mean being dragged into crushing rollers. Boiling juice splashed from kettles, causing burns so severe they exposed bone. Mistakes born of exhaustion led to deaths that were barely acknowledged. In the ledgers, these lives were reduced to figures, listed as losses of property, and quietly subtracted from the season's profits. The mortality rate on Louisiana sugar plantations was the highest in the American South. Plantation owners knew this. They planned for it. It was cheaper to work people to death and replace them than to slow production. Human life was an expendable cost, calculated with cold precision. This was the world into which those strange children were born. A world where bodies were owned, where consent did not exist, where the law offered no protection and no recourse. A world where power moved freely, unseen and unquestioned. The parishes themselves were tightly packed along the Mississippi River. Plantations sat close together, their boundaries marked by little more than a line of trees or a narrow bayou. The river served as highway, lifeline, and messenger. Steamboats passed constantly, carrying goods, mail, passengers, and rumors. News traveled fast here. A birth on one plantation was known on 3 others by morning. A death, a sale, a punishment. All became common knowledge almost immediately. This closeness made the mystery impossible to contain. When the unusual births began, they didn't happen in isolation. They echoed across the region, reinforcing one another until denial became impossible. The first plantation to record such a birth was Bellamont, a mid-sized sugar operation owned by the Duchamp family. The land had been in their possession for 3 generations, dating back to the Spanish colonial era. The main house stood in classic Creole style, raised on brick pillars to guard against flooding. with wide galleries wrapping around both floors. Moss, draped oak trees lined the long drive from the river road, creating a picture of southern elegance that masked the reality behind it. Behind the house, the sugar works spread outward. The mill, the boiling house, curing sheds, and the cooper's shop where barrels were made. Beyond that, screened by trees as if shame itself demanded distance, sat the quarters. 2 rows of cabins faced each other across a dirt path. Each cabin held multiple families, sometimes 10 or 12 people packed into a single room. There was no privacy, no comfort, no escape, only survival. The Duchamp family itself consisted of Philip Duchamp, his wife C.A. Lesty, and their 3 children. Philip was 48 years old in 1837, a thin, nervous man who had inherited the plantation from his father. He managed it with constant anxiety, forever worrying about yields, sugar prices, competition from Cuban imports, and the loans he'd taken to expand operations. He feared failure, feared ruin, feared losing the status his family name carried. What Philip Duchamp feared most, however, was not yet written plainly in any ledger, but it was already there, growing line by line, birth by birth, waiting to be uncovered. He worried constantly about slave rebellions whispered about in the Cane Rows, about abolitionists stirring trouble upriver, about the shifting political climate that threatened to crack the very foundation his wealth depended on. The world beyond the plantation gates was changing, and Philip Duchamp felt it, like a pressure in his chest he could neither name nor relieve. His overseer, Vincent Hébert, was 32 years old and had worked at Belmont for 6 years. Hébert was unusual among overseers, a fact Duchamp both valued and distrusted. He could read and write fluently in both French and English, a skill still rare enough to inspire suspicion. He kept meticulous records, ledgers so precise they bordered on obsession. He had a reputation for being firm, but not unnecessarily cruel, for maximizing productivity through schedules, rotations, and incentives rather than through terror. This made him valuable to Duchamp, who lacked the stomach for the raw violence many plantation owners considered not just acceptable, but essential. Hébert lived in a small house between the main residence and the quarters, positioned deliberately so he could observe both worlds without fully belonging to either. Every morning he rose before dawn, washed his face in cold water, and stepped outside to listen. The sounds of the plantation told him everything. The cough of engines warming, the shuffle of feet in the dark, the low murmur of voices before work began. He made his rounds, assigned work details, tracked progress, recorded everything in his ledgers with careful, elegant script. He knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name. He knew their skills, their weaknesses, their tempers, their family ties. He knew who worked better alone and who faltered without supervision, who could be trusted with tools, who might run if given the chance. This knowledge was power, and Hébert wielded it with deliberate restraint. It was Hébert who first noticed the anomaly in March of 1837. And it was Hébert who would spend the next 7 years, trying and failing to understand what it meant. The child was born just before dawn on March 14, 1837, delivered by an elderly enslaved midwife named Josephine. Over her 60-odd years, Josephine had brought more than 200 babies into the world. She had been born in St. Domingue before the Revolution, before it became Haiti, before blood and fire had reshaped the island. She'd been brought to Louisiana as a young woman and had survived everything that followed. The transition from French to American rule, multiple changes of ownership, the deaths of her own children, the endless bone-grinding labor of the sugar harvest. Josephine had seen every complication childbirth could bring: breech births, stillbirths, mothers who bled out on cabin floors while dawn crept through the cracks in the walls. Babies born too early to survive, their tiny chests fluttering like trapped birds. Twins tangled together. Infections that bloomed into fever and death. Over time, she had learned to keep her face neutral, to show no emotion, to do the work and move on to the next crisis. Survival demanded it. But when she cleaned the newborn girl and lifted her toward the lamplight, Josephine felt something she had not felt in years, genuine fear. The mother was a woman named Marie, dark-skinned, strong, 23 years old. She had been born on Belmont and had known no other life. Her mother had died in the sugar house when Marie was 12, caught by the grinding mill. Her screams cut short as the machinery pulled her in. Marie had watched it happen, standing 10 feet away, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything but witness. After that day, something inside her had closed. She spoke only when necessary, kept her eyes lowered, and did her work without complaint. She had been paired with a man named Thomas when she was 18, a pairing arranged by Hébert to produce children who would become plantation property. Thomas was a field hand, strong, reliable, 25 years old. They lived together in one corner of a cabin shared with 3 other families, separated by nothing more than hanging cloth and mutual understanding. Marie had already given birth to one child, a boy named Jack, now 4 years old. He looked like his parents, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, tightly coiled hair. He was healthy, alert, already being taught when to be quiet and when to work. This second child should have looked the same. Every expectation, every understanding of heredity, every lived observation suggested the baby would be dark-skinned, dark-eyed, dark-haired. Instead, when Josephine wiped away the birth fluids and held the infant closer to the lamp, she saw pale skin, hair so blonde it was nearly white, and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. Josephine wrapped the child quickly, her heart pounding. She had heard stories, of course, passed down from older midwives, stories that stretched back generations, tales of distant ancestry resurfacing, of hidden bloodlines revealing themselves unexpectedly. The old women spoke of African peoples mixing with Arab traders, Portuguese sailors, travelers who had crossed deserts and oceans long before any of them were born. Sometimes those mixtures returned, they said, producing lighter skin or unfamiliar features. But this was different. This was not a slight change in complexion or curl pattern. This child looked as though she had been born to a Swedish immigrant, not to Marie. The features were unmistakably European: the narrow nose, the thin lips, the sharp structure of the face. When Marie saw her daughter, she did not speak. She simply stared, her exhaustion giving way to something heavier. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Her hands trembled as she took the baby, and Josephine saw tears slide silently down her cheeks. "Does she look like anyone you know?" Josephine asked softly, a question weighted far beyond its words. Marie did not answer. Her silence said everything. She held her daughter close, rocking gently, and Josephine saw a grief so deep it seemed to press against the walls of the cabin itself. Thomas arrived an hour later, coming from the fields where he had been working the night shift during grinding season. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the child, his face draining of color. "That's not mine," he said flatly. "She is yours," Marie whispered. "She is." His voice rose, sharp and dangerous. "Look at her. Look at her and tell me that's my child." "Thomas, please." "Who did you?" "No one," Marie said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you. No one. I don't understand this." "I don't." Josephine stepped between them. "This happens sometimes," she said, though her heart told her otherwise. "Old blood coming through. Ancestors from long ago." Thomas stared at the baby, then at Marie, then at Josephine. Without another word, he turned and walked out. By midday, everyone on Belmont knew. The news moved through the quarters like wildfire. People crowded into the cabin to see for themselves, staring at the impossible child. Some whispered of curses and spirits, of punishment from God. Others said nothing at all, their faces tight with understanding they dared not voice. By evening, the story had reached neighboring plantations, carried by enslaved people with relatives elsewhere, by traders moving along the river, by the invisible network of communication that thrived beneath the surface of plantation life. By the end of the week, Vincent Hébert was summoned to the main house. He walked up the oak-lined drive with a knot in his stomach. He had questioned Marie gently, then with increasing pressure. She had sworn she had been with no one but Thomas, even as tears soaked her dress, even as she held her strange-looking daughter. Thomas had refused the child, moved out of the cabin, and requested reassignment to another crew. Hébert knew something was wrong. He just did not yet know how deeply this birth would reach into the heart of Belmont, or how impossible it would be to contain. Hébert stood before Monsieur Duchamp's desk as the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Duchamp did not invite him to sit. He never did when the matter was serious. "You will explain this to me," Duchamp said at last. His fingers steepled, his voice measured but tight. Slowly, Hébert did. He described the birth, Josephine's reaction, the mother's insistence, the father's refusal. He chose his words carefully, leaving out nothing and adding nothing. He did not speculate. He never speculated with Duchamp. When he finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "A white child," Duchamp said finally, as if tasting the words. "Born to 2 black parents." "Yes, sir." Duchamp rose and walked to the window, staring out at the fields. "People will talk. They already are. This kind of thing invites trouble." He paused. "Questions people should not ask." Hébert understood. A child like this did not simply disrupt order. It challenged it. It unsettled the stories everyone depended on to keep the world as it was. "I want her watched," Duchamp said quietly. "I want to know who goes near her, who speaks about her, who whispers. And I want the talk stopped." "Yes, sir." "And Hébert," Duchamp added without turning, "if this becomes something larger than a curiosity, you will handle it." Hébert nodded, though a chill settled in his chest. "Of course." The child was named Eliza. Marie whispered the name to Josephine the night after Thomas left, her voice barely audible. Josephine nodded and committed it to memory. Names mattered, even when they were not officially recorded. Eliza grew quickly, too quickly, Josephine thought. Her skin remained pale, her hair light as straw, her eyes a startling blue that seemed almost too large for her face. When she cried, the sound cut sharply through the quarters, drawing attention Marie did not want. Marie learned to soothe her fast, holding her close, humming low, never allowing her cries to linger. Thomas never returned. He worked with a different crew now, slept in a different cabin, and would not look at Marie when they passed. The rejection hollowed something inside her, but she did not break. She could not afford to. Hébert visited the cabin under the pretense of routine inspection. He stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space, and watched Marie nurse the child. Eliza's tiny hand gripped her mother's finger with surprising strength. "She's healthy," Hébert said. "Yes," Marie replied. "You understand the situation," he continued. "This child draws attention. Attention brings danger." Marie met his eyes for the first time. "She didn't ask to be born." "No," Hébert said quietly, "but she was." From that day forward, Eliza lived under invisible surveillance. Hébert ensured she remained close to Marie, was not paraded or displayed. He discouraged visitors and reassigned those who lingered too long near the cabin. Officially, it was to prevent distraction from work. Unofficially, it was containment. Still, the rumors grew. Some said the child was a sign. Others whispered of curses, spirits, or punishment from God. A few dared suggest what no one should have spoken, that the blood of the master's house ran closer to the quarters than anyone admitted. Those whispers vanished quickly. People who voiced them were reassigned, punished, or separated from family. The lesson was clear. Eliza survived infancy, then toddlerhood. She learned to walk early, to speak early. Her voice was clear, her words precise. She watched everything. Josephine noticed it first. The way Eliza's eyes followed movement. The way she seemed to understand more than she should. By the time Eliza was 3, she could repeat conversations she had only half heard. By 4, she was asking questions Marie could not answer. "Why don't I look like Jack?" she asked one evening. Marie's hand stilled.
"Why?"
"There are many kinds of different," Marie said, though the words felt thin even as she spoke them. Hébert observed these changes with growing unease. He recorded them in a separate ledger he did not show Duchamp. Notes on growth patterns, speech, behavior. It was no longer only Eliza's appearance that troubled him. It was her mind. By the time she turned 6, people avoided her, not because she was cruel or strange, but because she noticed things. She remembered things. She spoke truths accidentally, the way children sometimes do, without understanding how dangerous honesty could be. Hébert began to understand that the anomaly he had noticed in 1837 was not limited to skin and hair. Something deeper was unfolding, something that would not remain hidden forever. And Belmont, built on silence and control, was not prepared for a child who saw too clearly. The question was no longer where Eliza came from. It was what she would become, and what the plantation would do when it could no longer pretend she did not exist. Hébert questioned other enslaved people who lived in the same cabin, those who might have seen or heard something. No one had any information, or if they did, they weren't sharing it. Duchamp was pacing his study when Hébert arrived, his thin face pinched with worry. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. A portrait of Duchamp's father hung over the fireplace, stern and judgmental. "Sit down, Hébert. Tell me what happened." Hébert sat in the chair across from Duchamp's desk and laid out the facts as he knew them: the birth, the child's appearance, Marie's insistence that she'd been with no one but Thomas, the lack of any evidence or testimony to suggest otherwise. "It's not possible," Duchamp said, resuming his pacing. "Thomas is the father. It's in the records. I have the breeding records right here." He pulled out a ledger, flipped through pages. Marie and Thomas paired in 1832. First child born 1833. This is the second. Thomas is the father. "Yes, sir," Hébert replied carefully. "That's what the records show. But the child? I don't care what the child looks like." Duchamp interrupted, his voice sharp with anxiety. "There's an explanation. There must be mixed ancestry. Perhaps some distant relative. These things happen, sir. I've seen mixed ancestry. This is different. This child looks completely European." Duchamp stopped pacing and stared at Hébert. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm simply reporting what I've observed. Because if you're suggesting that someone, that one of us..." Duchamp couldn't finish the sentence. The implication was too dangerous, too scandalous. "I'm not suggesting anything," Hébert repeated. "I'm asking what you want me to do." Duchamp sat down heavily in his chair. He looked suddenly older, more tired. "Record the birth. Note the unusual appearance, but the father of record remains Thomas."
"Is that clear?" "Yes, sir."
"And Hébert, I don't want this discussed. Not with the other overseers, not with anyone. It's a private matter. An anomaly, nothing more. Yes, sir. Hébert left the main house with a troubled mind. He understood Duchamp's position. Any suggestion that a white man had fathered a child with an enslaved woman would be scandalous. But it wouldn't be shocking. Such things happened, though they were rarely acknowledged openly. The real problem was the implication of force or violation, because Marie insisted she'd been with no one but Thomas. Which meant if the child wasn't Thomas's, then something had happened to Marie without her consent. And if that was true, if someone had violated an enslaved woman on Duchamp's property, it raised questions about security, about control, about the order that was supposed to govern plantation life. It suggested that someone had access to the quarters, to the women, without oversight or consequence. Hébert went back to his house and opened his personal journal. Separate from the official plantation records, he wrote down everything he knew about the birth, about Marie's testimony, about the child's appearance. He dated the entry carefully, March 14, 1837. He had no way of knowing that this entry would be the first of many, that he was documenting the beginning of something that would consume the next 7 years of his life. The child was named Claire. Marie tried to care for her, tried to love her, but the baby was a constant reminder of something Marie couldn't explain and couldn't escape. Thomas never acknowledged Claire as his daughter. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. The other enslaved people on Belmont were divided in their reactions. Some felt sympathy for Marie, understanding that something terrible had happened to her, even if she couldn't or wouldn't speak of it. Others were suspicious, believing she must have been with someone, must have done something to bring this situation on herself. A few were frightened, sensing that Claire's existence meant something dangerous, something that threatened them all. Claire grew. She was a healthy baby, meeting all the normal milestones, but her appearance became more striking as she aged. Her hair grew in thick and blonde. Her eyes remained that startling blue. Her skin stayed pale, burning easily in the Louisiana sun. By the time she was 6 months old, she looked like a Nordic child who had somehow ended up in the quarters of a Louisiana plantation. The contrast between her appearance and her surroundings was jarring, disturbing, impossible to ignore. And then, 14 months after Claire's birth, it happened again. The second birth occurred on a plantation called Riverside, 6 miles upriver from Belmont. Riverside was larger than Belmont, with more acreage under cultivation and a larger enslaved population. The owner was a man named Broussard, 55 years old, a second-generation Louisiana planter whose family had made their fortune in the sugar trade. Broussard was known for running a profitable operation. He was also known for his temper, for his willingness to use violence to maintain control, for his belief that enslaved people needed to be kept in a state of fear to remain productive. His overseer, a man named Gideon Frost, shared this philosophy. Frost was 40 years old, a transplant from Virginia who had come to Louisiana seeking opportunity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. He carried a whip coiled at his belt and wasn't afraid to use it. The enslaved people at Riverside feared him, and Frost believed that fear was the foundation of good management. The mother was a woman named Lavoine, 20 years old, who worked in the main house as a seamstress. She had been selected for this position because of her quiet demeanor, her efficiency, her ability to remain invisible. House servants had to master this skill, the ability to be present but not noticed, to move through rooms without drawing attention, to hear conversations without appearing to listen. Lavoine had been born on a plantation in the Natchez district, and sold to Riverside when she was 15. The sale had separated her from her mother and 2 younger siblings. She'd never seen them again. This loss had hollowed her out, left her with a kind of emptiness that she filled with work, with routine, with the small comforts she could find. A moment of rest, a full meal, the absence of pain. She'd been paired with a field hand named Samuel, 22 years old, strong and quiet. They lived together in the quarters, shared a space in one of the cabins. Their relationship was cordial but not close. They were 2 people thrown together by someone else's decision, doing their best inside a life neither had chosen. In that narrow space between fear and survival, Deline learned she was pregnant, and the knowledge settled into her like a storm cloud that carried both dread and light. Pregnancy meant weakness, pain, and the real possibility of death. Yet beneath the fear lived a fragile hope. A child would be something that belonged to her, something she could love, even if only briefly before the plantation claimed it as its own. The months passed without complication. Deline worked as she always had in the laundry, hauling heavy buckets of water, scrubbing stained cloth until her hands cracked, hanging damp garments in the thick, suffocating air. As her body changed, the labor became heavier, but she said nothing. Complaints invited punishment, and silence was safer. She gave birth in May of 1838. The plantation midwife, Ruth, attended her through a night of relentless pain that stretched into the next morning. When the child finally came, he cried loudly, strong and alive. Relief washed through Deline until Ruth froze. The midwife cleaned the infant, then stopped. Her hands trembled. Color drained from her face. "What is it?" Deline asked weakly, reaching out. "What's wrong?" Ruth did not answer. She placed the child in Deline's arms and stepped back. The world tipped sideways. The baby had pale skin, almost translucent blonde hair, blue eyes. He looked nothing like her, nothing like Samuel, nothing like anyone she had ever known. "No," Deline whispered. "No, this isn't. This can't be." "Who's the father?" Ruth asked softly. "Samuel," Deline said immediately. "Samuel is the father. I haven't been with anyone else. I swear it." "Then how do you explain this child?" "I can't," Deline said as tears slid down her face. "I can't explain it." Samuel was brought from the fields. One look was enough. His anger came fast and cold. "You've been with someone," he said flatly. "I haven't. I swear." "Don't lie to me. Look at him. That's not my child." "He is. He has to be." "Then who did this?" "I don't know," Deline sobbed. "I don't know." Samuel left and never came back. He asked to be moved, to be placed with a different crew in a different cabin. From that day forward, he never once acknowledged the boy. By nightfall, Gideon Frost arrived. He pushed into the cabin, stared at the child, and demanded answers. "This isn't Samuel's," he said. "Look at it." "I swear I haven't been with anyone else." Deline repeated the words until her voice broke. Frost questioned her for hours, threats sharpening with every repetition. Still, her story never changed. At last, he reported the matter to Brossard. Brossard's response was fury. Not at the mystery, but at the inconvenience. He blamed Frost for losing control, for allowing disorder. When no explanation surfaced, he ordered the birth recorded anyway. Samuel was named the father. The matter was closed. Silence was enforced. The child was named Jean. Like Claire before him, he was a living contradiction. Proof of something that should not have existed. When word reached Belmont, Vincent Hébert felt certainty settle into his bones. This was not chance, not coincidence. Something deliberate was happening. He recorded everything. Dates, names, plantations, circumstances. He compared births, traced movements, followed quiet patterns no one else seemed willing to see. The connections sharpened, and with them dread. 5 children. 5 plantations. One shared shadow, Dr. Marcus Lavoine, always nearby, always present, always with access. Hébert traced the doctor's movements with trembling hands, aligning visits with conception dates. Every time, the pattern held, too precise, too consistent. He tried to speak to the women. One by one, they refused. Not because they didn't know, but because knowing offered no protection. Silence was survival. Finally, Hébert took his findings to Judge Armand Thibodeaux. The judge listened carefully, weighed every word, then gave the answer Hébert had feared. There was no crime the law would recognize, no testimony the court would accept, no punishment for a man like Lavoine. Stop, Thibodeaux told him. Say nothing. Let this disappear. Hébert left the courthouse knowing the truth had already been buried. Judge Thibodeaux did make inquiries, quietly, carefully, but nothing came of them. No charges, no scandal, no justice, and across the plantations life went on. The children grew. Their pale faces and light eyes became unspoken warnings. Proof not of a miracle, but of power unchecked. Proof that some crimes were invisible not because they were hidden, but because the world refused to see them. And in private journals, in quiet memories, the truth remained, waiting for a time when silence would no longer be the only way to survive. They did not belong anywhere. Too pale for the quarters, too dark in origin for the main house. They lived in the narrow space between worlds, constantly watched, constantly whispered about. Their presence unsettled everyone who saw them. Overseers avoided looking at them too closely. Planter families pretended not to notice. The enslaved learned not to ask questions aloud. Jean grew quickly. By the time he was 5, his hair had lightened almost to white in the sun, his eyes an unsettling blue that seemed to absorb everything around him. Deline loved him fiercely, but love did not protect him. Other children kept their distance. Some were frightened of him. Others repeated the words they'd heard adults whisper. Words about curses, about sins passed down, about things that should never have happened. Deline tried to shield him. She taught him when to stay silent, when to lower his eyes, when to make himself small. She knew too well what happened to children who drew attention. Still, attention followed him like a shadow. When Dr. Marcus Lavoine returned to Riverside for a routine visit in the summer of 1844, Deline felt something tighten in her chest. She had not seen him since before Jean was born, but recognition struck her instantly: the pale hair, the blue eyes, the calm, controlled movements. Jean stood beside her as Lavoine passed through the yard. The doctor's gaze flickered down for a fraction of a second. He did not stop. He did not speak. But his eyes lingered, and Deline felt the weight of that look settle over her like a hand on her throat. That night, she did not sleep. Across the river parishes, the same unease spread. At Oakmont, Isabel watched her daughter's reflection grow sharper each year, her face mirroring features that could not be explained. At St. Clair, Chure learned to keep her son hidden whenever visitors came. At Magnolia Grove, Pauline's girl was sent away early, sold to a distant plantation under the excuse of practical necessity. Vincent Hébert continued to write. His journals thickened with names, movements, quiet observations. He tracked Lavoine's travels even after Judge Thibodeaux warned him to stop. He noted which plantations requested the doctor most often, which households welcomed him late at night, which women were reassigned to housework shortly before his arrival. And he noticed something else. Lavoine never acknowledged the children, never publicly, never openly. But he arranged care for them when they were ill. He ensured they were not sold too young. He intervened quietly when punishments grew severe. Always indirectly, always with plausible deniability. It was not kindness, it was control. By 1846, rumors had begun to circulate beyond the plantations. Traders whispered about strange children along the river. A priest refused to baptize one, claiming the matter required guidance from higher authority. A visiting doctor remarked once that such cases were medically fascinating, then declined to elaborate. Hébert realized then that Lavoine was not hiding his actions out of fear. He was hiding them because he believed himself untouchable, and perhaps he was. The system protected men like him. The law erased women like Lavoine. The children existed only as ledger entries, as anomalies no one wished to explain. But systems rot when patterns become too large to ignore. In the winter of 1848, a child at Belmont fell gravely ill. Claire, fever seizures, pain that twisted her small body. Lavoine was summoned in haste. He arrived at night. Hébert watched from the shadows as the doctor entered the quarters, his movements unhurried, composed. Hours passed before he emerged. Claire survived, but something had changed. She no longer spoke. From that night on, Hébert understood the truth he had been circling for years. Lavoine was not finished, and the children were not accidents. They were experiments. Hébert spoke to 3 of the plantation owners privately, arranging meetings that left no public record. He asked vague questions about Dr. Lavoine's visits, about unusual occurrences, about the births of the distinctive-looking children. The responses were uniformly defensive. The plantation owners saw the questions as threats to their property values, their reputations, their social standing. They insisted there was nothing unusual, nothing that required investigation. The children were anomalies, genetic quirks, nothing more. Anatole Broussard, the owner of Riverside, was particularly hostile. He met with Thibaudeaux in his study, a room dominated by a massive desk and portraits of his ancestors. "Are you suggesting that I don't know what happens on my own property?" Broussard demanded, his face flushed with anger. "That I can't control my own people. This is insulting, Armand. Deeply insulting." "I'm not suggesting anything of the kind." Thibaudeaux replied calmly. "I'm simply following up on some concerns that have been brought to my attention." "Concerns? What concerns?" "That some babies were born with light skin. That happens sometimes. Mixed ancestry. Distant bloodlines. It's not unusual. 5 babies in 2 years, Anatole. All on different plantations, all with the same distinctive features. So that's coincidence. Nothing more. And all the mothers had contact with Dr. Lavoine in the months before conception." Broussard's face went from flushed to pale. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. Dr. Lavoine is a respected physician. He's treated my family for years. He's above reproach. I'm sure he is. But the pattern—" "There is no pattern," Broussard interrupted. "There are coincidences. And I won't have you spreading rumors that could damage a good man's reputation, or mine. Do you understand?" Thibaudeaux understood. He understood that Broussard was more concerned about scandal than about truth, more worried about property values than about justice. He understood that pushing further would make enemies of powerful men, would damage his own position, would accomplish nothing. The other plantation owners gave similar responses. They were defensive, hostile, unwilling to consider that something wrong might have happened on their properties. To admit that would be to admit failure of control, failure of oversight, failure of the system itself. Within 2 weeks, Thibaudeaux sent word to Hébert that the investigation was closed. There was insufficient evidence to proceed. The matter was to be dropped. Hébert received the news with bitter resignation. He'd expected it. But the confirmation still stung. He filed his notes away, locked them in his desk, and tried to return to his normal duties. But the birth didn't stop. In November 1840, another child was born at a plantation called Sweetwater, 8 miles south of Belmont. The plantation was smaller than most, specializing in indigo rather than sugar. The owner was a widow named Madame Hébert, no relation to Vincent, who ran the operation with the help of her son. The mother was a woman named Cecile, 24 years old, who worked in the sugar house during grinding season and in the fields the rest of the year. The baby was a boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Cecile's partner, a man named Joseph, refused to acknowledge the child. Dr. Lavoine had been called to Sweetwater 3 months earlier to treat Madame Hébert's son for a fever. He'd stayed for 2 days, sleeping in a guest room, taking his meals with the family. In March 1841, another birth at Riverside. The mother was a different woman this time, a field hand named Let, 21 years old. The baby was a girl with the same distinctive features. Let's partner, a man named Michel, left her after the birth. Dr. Lavoine had attended a social gathering at Riverside in December of 1840. In August 1841, another birth at Oakmont. The mother was a woman named Marguerite, 23 years old, who worked in the main house. The baby was a boy. Marguerite's partner, a man named Henry, refused to speak to her after the birth. Lavoine had been called to Oakmont to treat an injured field hand in May of 1841. In January 1842, another birth at a new plantation, Cypress Point, 10 miles north of Bellamont. The mother was a woman named Addie Lee, 20 years old. The baby was a girl. Addie Lee's partner, a man named François, requested a transfer to a different plantation. Lavoine had attended a dinner party at Cypress Point in October of 1841. The pattern continued, relentless and undeniable. Vincent Hébert documented each birth in his private journal. Even though he'd been told to stop his investigation, he couldn't let it go. The pattern was too clear, too deliberate. 9 children now, all with the same impossible features, all connected to Dr. Lavoine. And with each new birth, the whispers grew louder. The enslaved community knew something was wrong. They couldn't speak openly, couldn't accuse, couldn't demand justice. But they knew, and they began to protect themselves. Women started refusing assignments to the main houses. They claimed illness, injury, any excuse to avoid being called up from the quarters. When pressed, they became sullen, resistant, uncooperative. Overseers noticed the resistance and responded with punishment. Women were whipped for refusing work assignments, for claiming false illness, for insubordination. But the resistance continued. The women seemed willing to accept punishment rather than risk being called to the main houses. This created problems for the plantation operations. House servants were necessary for the smooth functioning of the main houses. Laundry had to be penned. Meals had to be prepared. Rooms had to be cleaned. When women refused these assignments, the work fell to others, creating resentment and disruption. The tension on the plantations became palpable. Productivity dropped. Small acts of rebellion increased. Tools were broken. Work slowed. Minor acts of sabotage accumulated into significant disruption. The plantation owners blamed their overseers for losing control. The overseers blamed the enslaved workers for being lazy and rebellious. No one wanted to acknowledge the real cause of the unrest, except Vincent Hébert. He saw what was happening, understood the fear that drove it. The women were protecting themselves the only way they could through resistance and refusal, even at the cost of punishment. And he made a decision that would change everything. He began documenting the births again. But this time, he didn't keep the information to himself. He shared it carefully and selectively with other overseers, with traders, with anyone who might listen. He created copies of his map, his timeline, his evidence connecting Dr. Lavoine to each incident. He knew it was dangerous. He knew he was risking his position, possibly his life, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. The information spread slowly at first, then faster. Overseers talked to each other, comparing notes, sharing stories. Traders carried the information from plantation to plantation, from parish to parish. The whispers became conversations. The conversations became discussions. By the summer of 1842, the story was known throughout the 3 parishes. It was discussed in hushed conversations, in plantation offices, in letters between plantation owners, in the careful language of people who understood they were approaching something explosive. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal was becoming public knowledge. And finally, inevitably, the story reached Dr. Marcus Lavoine himself. Lavoine's response was not what anyone expected. He didn't deny the accusations. He didn't flee. He didn't show any sign of shame or fear. Instead, he called a meeting in September 1842. He sent formal invitations to the owners of all the affected plantations, asking them to gather at his home on a Thursday evening. He also invited Judge Thibodeaux, several other prominent citizens, and, surprisingly, Vincent Hébert. The invitations were polite but firm. Lavoine wrote that he understood there had been questions about certain matters, and he wished to address these questions directly and comprehensively. He requested the courtesy of a hearing before any further action was taken. The plantation owners were caught off guard. The invitation itself was unusual, almost unprecedented. But they agreed to attend, curious about what Lavoine might say, how he might defend himself. Hébert received his invitation with a sense of dread. He didn't know what Lavoine was planning, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening, September 15, 1842. The air was thick with humidity and the threat of rain. 15 men gathered at Lavoine's home, a modest but well-appointed house on the outskirts of the parish seat. The house was built in the American style rather than Creole, with a symmetrical façade and a central hallway. Lavoine greeted each guest personally as they arrived, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the role of gracious host. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes clear and steady. He showed no sign of nervousness or concern. When all the guests had arrived, Lavoine led them to his parlor, a room furnished with comfortable chairs, arranged in a semicircle. A sideboard held decanters of whiskey and brandy, glasses, cigars. Lavoine invited the men to help themselves, to make themselves comfortable. The atmosphere was surreal. It felt like a social gathering, not a confrontation. The men sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting to hear what the doctor had to say. Lavoine stood before them, calm and composed. He held a glass of brandy in one hand and took a small sip before beginning to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I understand there have been questions about certain births that have occurred over the past several years. Questions about the appearance of these children, about their parentage, about my possible involvement." The room was absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on Lavoine. "I want to address these questions directly and honestly," Lavoine continued. "I believe that clarity is preferable to rumor, that truth is preferable to speculation. So let me be clear. Yes, I am the father of these children. All of them." The silence shattered into chaos. Men shouted, stood, demanded explanations. Judge Thibodeaux called for order, his voice barely audible over the uproar. Broussard was on his feet, his face purple with rage. Duchamp looked as though he might faint. Lavoine waited, patient, sipping his brandy until the room quieted again. It took several minutes. "I understand your shock," Lavoine said when he could be heard again. "But before you judge me, I ask that you hear my explanation. What I have done with purpose and with what I believe to be sound reasoning." "Sound reasoning," Broussard shouted. "You violated." "I have conducted an experiment," Lavoine interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "A scientific experiment that I believe has profound implications for our understanding of human heredity and racial characteristics." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Confused. Horrified. Lavoine walked to a desk in the corner of the room and retrieved a leather-bound journal. He held it up so everyone could see. "For the past 7 years," he said, "I have been studying the question of racial inheritance. Specifically, I wanted to understand whether the physical characteristics we associate with race are immutable, or whether they can be altered through selective breeding." He opened the journal, showing pages filled with notes, diagrams, measurements, observations. The handwriting was neat and precise, the work of someone who took pride in documentation. "I theorized," Lavoine continued, "that by introducing European genetic material into the African population, I could produce offspring that displayed European features. The children born over these years have confirmed my hypothesis. Regardless of the mother's appearance, my genetic contribution has dominated, producing children with blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin." Vincent Hébert felt physically ill. Around him, other men showed similar reactions: pale faces, clenched jaws, hands gripping chair arms. The casual way Lavoine spoke about human beings, about women, about children, was more disturbing than any rage or justification would have been. "You're talking about human beings," Thibodeau said, his voice shaking. "Not livestock, not experimental subjects, human beings." "Am I?" Lavoine asked, turning to face the judge. His expression was genuinely curious, as though this were an interesting philosophical question. "The law of this state says otherwise," Judge Thibodeau. "The law says these women are property. The law says their children are property. I have violated no statute, broken no law. I have simply used available resources to pursue scientific knowledge." "You've committed rape," Hébert said, the word hanging in the air like poison, "multiple times, against women who had no ability to refuse you, no ability to protect themselves." Lavoine turned to him, his expression unchanged. "Rape is a crime committed against persons, Mr. Hébert. These women are not legally persons. They are property. I have no more committed rape than a farmer commits rape when he breeds his cattle. The law is quite clear on this point." The logic was monstrous, but it was also legally sound. Louisiana law in 1842 did not recognize enslaved people as having the legal standing to be victims of rape. They were property, and property could not be raped. The law protected property owners from theft or damage to their property, but it did not protect the property itself from the actions of others. Several of the plantation owners looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up to challenge Lavoine's reasoning, because to do so would be to challenge the entire legal and social structure that supported their way of life. If enslaved people were persons with rights, then the entire system of slavery became untenable. "Why?" Duchamp asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do this? What did you hope to gain?" "Knowledge," Lavoine replied simply. "Understanding. I wanted to prove that racial characteristics are not fixed, that they can be manipulated through selective breeding. This has implications for everything. For slavery, for colonization, for the future of human civilization." He walked back to the center of the room, his journal still in his hand. "Consider the possibilities," he said, his voice taking on an almost evangelical quality. "If we can alter racial traits through selective breeding, we can reshape entire populations. We can create workers ideally suited to specific climates and tasks. We can eliminate undesirable characteristics and enhance desirable ones. We can engineer the future of humanity itself." "You're insane," someone muttered. "I'm a scientist," Lavoine corrected, "and my experiment has been successful. The children exist. The evidence is undeniable. I have proven that European traits dominate African traits in mixed offspring. This is valuable knowledge, gentlemen, knowledge that could be used to advance our understanding of human biology, of heredity, of the very nature of race itself. Judge Thibodeau stood, his face flushed with anger and something else, disgust perhaps, or horror at what he was hearing. "Dr. Lavoine," he said, his voice hard. "Regardless of the legal technicalities, what you've done is morally reprehensible. You've caused immense suffering to women who had no ability to refuse you. You've destroyed families. You've disrupted multiple plantations. You've created a scandal that will damage this entire region. I've created knowledge." Lavoine replied calmly. "What you do with that knowledge is your concern, not mine. I've documented everything. In this journal, and in others, my methods, my observations, my conclusions. This information will be valuable to future scientists, to future generations." "You will leave this parish," Thibodeau said. "You will cease your practice here, sell your property, and go. If you refuse, I will find a way to bring charges. Legal technicalities be damned. I will make your life here impossible." Lavoine smiled slightly, and the smile was somehow more disturbing than anything else he'd said. "I've already made arrangements to leave, Judge Thibodeau. My work here is complete. I've gathered sufficient data. I'm relocating to Texas, where I plan to continue my research on a larger scale. The frontier offers opportunities that are not available in more settled regions." "Get out," Brassard said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get out of this parish. Get out of Louisiana. And if I ever see you again, I'll kill you myself." Lavoine set down his brandy glass and inclined his head slightly, as though accepting a compliment. "I'll be gone within the week," he said. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen. I thought it important that you understand the truth of what has occurred. Rumors and speculation serve no one." The meeting dissolved into angry arguments, threats and recriminations. But in the end, there was nothing anyone could do. Lavoine had broken no law. He could not be prosecuted, could not be punished through official channels. The system that should have protected the women he'd violated had instead protected him. Within 2 weeks, he was gone. His house was sold to a merchant from New Orleans. His practice was transferred to another doctor. His furniture, his books, his personal effects were packed and shipped. He vanished into the expanding American frontier, taking his journals, his data, and his monstrous certainty with him. The aftermath of Lavoine's revelation spread through the parishes like a fever. The plantation owners tried to suppress the story, but it was too late. Too many people knew. The scandal became common knowledge, discussed in New Orleans parlors, in riverboat saloons, in the careful letters that passed between planter families across Louisiana and beyond. The children remained, of course. 13 of them by the time Lavoine left, ranging in age from newborn to 5 years old. They grew up in the quarters, marked by their appearance, living proof of what had been done to their mothers. The mothers struggled with their children in different ways. Some, like Marie, tried to love these children despite everything. Marie held Claire close, soothed her, protected her as best she could. But there was always a distance, a wall that Marie couldn't quite break through. Every time she looked at Claire, she saw the violation, the helplessness, the night that had changed everything. Others couldn't bear to look at their children. Deline at Riverside became withdrawn and silent after Jean's birth. She cared for him mechanically, feeding him, keeping him clean, but showing no affection. When Jean reached for her, she would turn away. When he cried, she would hand him to another woman to comfort. The children sensed this rejection, even as infants. They grew up knowing they were different, knowing they were unwanted, knowing their very existence caused pain. The fathers, the men who had been recorded as fathers, the men who had been partners to these women, reacted with anger and abandonment. Thomas never acknowledged Claire. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin where she lived, avoided even looking at the child when their paths crossed. Eventually, he requested a transfer to another plantation, and Duchamp granted it, glad to be rid of a source of tension. Samuel at Riverside did the same. So did Gabriel at Oakmont, Louis at Sweetwater, Joseph at Cypress Point, Michelle at Riverside, Henry at Oakmont, Franz Oys at Cypress Point, and the others. These men had been paired with these women by their owners, forced into relationships they hadn't chosen. But they'd made lives together, found small comforts and companionship. The births destroyed those fragile connections. The women were left alone, raising children who looked nothing like them. Children who were constant reminders of violation and powerlessness. The enslaved community was divided in its response. Some people felt sympathy for the mothers, understanding that something terrible had happened to them. They helped when they could, watching the strange, looking children, sharing food, offering what comfort was possible. Others were suspicious or hostile. They believed the mothers must have done something to bring this on themselves, must have been willing participants. They whispered about the women, spread rumors, shunned them. The children grew up in this atmosphere of suspicion and division. They were neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, existing in a liminal space within the quarters. As they got older, their appearance became even more striking. By the time Claire was 5 years old, she looked like a Swedish child who had somehow ended up on a Louisiana plantation. Her hair was long and blonde, her eyes that startling blue, her skin pale and prone to burning. She stood out among the other children like a candle in darkness. The same was true for all of Lavoine's children. They were beautiful in a conventional European sense, and this beauty made them valuable in a specific way. As they grew older, some were sold to traders who specialized in what were euphemistically called fancy girls, enslaved women with light skin who were sold for sexual exploitation. The boys were sometimes kept as house servants, their appearance making them suitable for positions where they would be seen by visitors. This was another layer of horror. Lavoine's experiment had not only violated the mothers, but had also created children who would be exploited because of their appearance, because of the very features that marked them as different. Vincent Hébert continued as overseer at Bellemont for 3 more years after Lavoine's departure, but he found it increasingly difficult to continue in his position. Every day he saw Claire growing up, saw Maurice, saw the evidence of a crime that had no legal name and no possibility of justice. In 1845, he resigned his position and moved to New Orleans. He found work as a clerk in a shipping office, a job that paid less but allowed him to sleep at night. He took his journals with him, the careful documentation of everything that had happened. Years later, in 1867, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, Hébert donated his journals to a historical society. He wrote a cover letter explaining what the documents contained, why he'd kept them, what they represented. These records, he wrote, document a crime that was not legally a crime, a violation that was not legally a violation, suffering that was not legally suffering. They show how a system designed to treat human beings as property created conditions where the most monstrous acts could be committed without consequence. I kept these records because I believed that someday someone would want to know the truth, that someday the truth would matter. The journals were filed away in an archive, rarely examined, a testament to a crime that was never officially acknowledged. Judge Thibodeaux tried to pursue legal action against Lavoine, but every attorney he consulted gave him the same answer: there was no case. No law had been broken. The women had no legal standing to bring charges. The plantation owners had no grounds for complaint, since their property had not been damaged in any legally recognized way. Thibodeaux spent months,